Working It Out, a podcast show about diversity, equity, and inclusion in our workplaces, our communities, and our lives. A show where we put diversity and inclusion to work.
Got problems on the job, we're working it out. Workplace got you stressing, we're working it out. Yeah, we're working it out, working it out, working it out.
Welcome to Working It Out. I'm Dr. Vanessa Weaver, your host. On today's episode of Working It Out, we'll be having a conversation on diversity, equity, and inclusion. We usually call it DEI versus what is known as anti-racism work. And we're joined by Dana Brownlee, who is the author of the Unwritten Rules of Managing Up. And she's also an acclaimed thought leader around managing different personalities, navigating challenging situations in the workplace, and speaking truth to power. As a senior contributor for Forbes Careers and author of several LinkedIn learning courses, Dana's business experience has also been featured by CNN, The Wall Street Journal, The Economist, Working Mother, Entrepreneur, and other notable publications. Welcome, Dana. We're so glad to have you here.
I'm so glad to be here, Dr. Weaver. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you. Dana, you have extensive experience in the corporate arena, and we can safely assume by being a Black woman in that arena, you have many stories that have led you into anti-racist work and also DEI work. But because we kind of can get caught up in jargon and titles and all of that, I'd like for you to tell us what is the distinction between DEI, which we call diversity, equity, and inclusion, and anti-racism work.
And I thank you for that question, because I think that's an amazing place to start. And it might sound like it's very rudimentary, but I would argue that the core of that question is so important. And part of the reason why there's been so little progress, particularly for Black professionals in the workplace. So from my perspective, DEI is a really broad umbrella, as it should be. It covers, it's about creating inclusive workplaces and having everyone feel valued. And absolutely, that's what we want. And so that umbrella needs to be really broad. It needs to include lots of differences we can see, and sometimes differences that we can't see. But anti-racism is a specialized area that I would argue really requires specific intentional focus. The analogy I like to use sometimes is my husband is a family practice physician. So he's really trained broadly. He's trained to see from the time you're a baby until until you die. But he very, very often refers things out. Because if you've really got a heart problem, you need to go to a cardiologist. You don't need to see him. Or if he suspects cancer, he's sending you to an oncologist. So I submit that anti-racism is one particular area that oftentimes is underrepresented, not focused on as much, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally. But I think that distinction is so important, because too many organizations have DEI organizations or DEI leaders, or they're doing DEI stuff and they're thinking they're doing anti-racism work, but they're not.
Well, give us an example of anti-racism work, because I know with the work we do in alignment strategies and the work that you've done, when people hear the term racist or racism, it gets really scary, and it kind of creates a lot of anxiety and discomfort, particularly in organizations. And so when you use the term anti-racist work, what would be an example of that? How does this show up in the everyday workplace?
Right. So for me, anti-racism is just really simple. It's actively working against racism. But we all know there's so many types of isms out there. There's ageism and ableism. And I mean, there's just so many other areas that are important and require attention and focus. But what I tend to find, you hit the nail on the head. People would rather talk about something that's more comfortable. So what tends to happen, particularly if you have someone, I think the article that you had cited or you had looked at talked about how most chief diversity officers are white. And it's not to say that white people don't play an important role, and white is European American is a race just like other races. So it's not to exclude anyone from the conversation, but it's to say that if your intention is to specifically focus on racism, racism isn't the only ill, but it is a particular one. And what tends to happen too often, I would submit, is people just default to talking about other things that they feel much more comfortable with and confident and knowledgeable about, to be quite honest. And so they'll skip over the racism conversation because that feels like a more difficult or more uncomfortable conversation to have. And so tragically, it tends to not get had oftentimes. And so that's why I'm saying, for me, it's very much a both and. DEI is important. That broad work is very important. Like, my husband, the work he does, primary care, very important. But we need dermatology, we need cardiology, we need oncology. We need those specialist areas as well to really dig in.
Well, I'm so glad you made that distinction, because I think when people read your article, which you talked about why corporate DEI efforts have tragically failed Black professionals, many of them were feeling like you were not really in support of diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. And that's really not what you're saying, are you? I mean, what I hear you saying is that there is a racism aspect in this that impacts Black people and maybe other people of color that needs to be called out and focused on.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak to that a little bit more specifically. I think there are two things that I would say about that. I do agree that many organizations are not doing DEI well. And so I think that there are organizations where it's not being done well, and those organizations certainly need to be accountable for stepping up and doing a better job. In addition to that, I think that DEI and anti-racism are not one and the same. For organizations that are doing DEI well, perhaps they are doing more with anti-racism. But I just think, that second point is that just because you have a DEI organization or you're celebrating Heritage Months doesn't necessarily mean you're doing anti-racism work, because anti-racism work is really about understanding where those racial disparities exist and actually doing the work to create that equity, to wind that back, to counter that oppression, to say, well, we don't have any Black people on our board of directors. And it's not just about, picking sprinkling a few chocolate chips in there and checking the box to say we're done. It's more so approaching it, like my background is business strategy, approaching it as you would any other business problem to say, well, wait a minute, how did we end up here? How is it that we live in a city that's diverse, we have a customer base that's diverse, but that diversity is not showing up in our leadership? Let's do some root cause analysis to figure out how we got here, and then more importantly, what we're going to do going forward to try to work against these processes, policies that may have led us to a result that's antithetical to what we want to see in the workplace.
That's interesting. I mean, thank you for that example, because when DEI work is being done very well, that's diversity, equity, and inclusion, part of that speaks to really doing that root cause analysis. When it's because you talked about a lot of it isn't being done well. And so is it a semantic issue? I mean, is there, like, if you're doing DEI work really well, and you're doing root cause analysis, you're talking about critical race theory, you're talking about a lot of aspects of race and racism, then is that anti-race work, or is that DEI work being done well? How do you see that?
Just really practically speaking, if you want to check to see, hey, are we really doing anti-racism work? How often is the word anti-racism showing up in what you're doing? How often is the word racism showing up in what you're doing? I'm gonna say it's not a difficult leap to say, if we're not ever uttering the words anti-racism, racism, oppression, racial apartheid, if we're not talking about that stuff, then we're probably not doing that work. And so I think it's very simple. You can just look at the language, and I think that can at least be a pointer.
Well, that's a phenomenal point, because before George Floyd, untimely, unfortunate murder, people were really kind of tiptoeing around this whole conversation about race. And in fact, in many of the companies we worked in, many of the African-American and Blacks in those corporations will say, look, our company is talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, but they don't really want to focus on the Black experience and how racism has driven us to where we are, our inability to get equitable promotions and things like that. So you're saying if a company isn't comfortable using the term race and talking about race or calling it out, then it's probably not as aggressive in this space as they need to be. That's what I'm hearing you say.
Sorry, I'll give you a great example. A law firm had contacted me, and this was like right in, because things were hot, and companies were on board, and the PR wagon and BLM was hot, and let's donate $1 billion, and let's put a million Black women on the board, and so all that energy was there, and then it cooled off, as many of us suspected it would. But right when we were in the heat of it, I was contacted by this law firm. And they were gung-ho that they really, and the term that a lot of them were using, you saw this in a lot of PR statements, it's not enough to just be not racist, you have to be anti-racist, okay? So they had read Kendi's work, and they were just really on board. So as I was talking to them, and I had long conversations with them, and they had selected one of my presentations that talked about white privilege. I don't even think I used to, it was white privilege, and I can't remember what the other term was. And systemic racism. So it was about systemic racism and white privilege. And they came back to me and were like, okay, yeah, we really want this, but could we not use the term privilege? Okay. And it's like you want it, but you don't want it. So I think that's it's a great example. And to your point, all of the support for Black Lives Matter, all these hashtags and yard signs, Black Lives Matter didn't start with George Floyd. They could have supported Black Lives Matter, the day before George Floyd was murdered. They could have supported it the year before, 2 years before. They could have donated all this money. Like, this is not news. The fact that there are these disparities, this is not news. This is not groundbreaking. So unfortunately, a lot of that was more motivated by the collective shame, more motivated by the media attention, more motivated by the PR opportunity, to be quite honest, that it got to the point where if you didn't issue a statement, somebody was looking at you like, wait a minute, where's your company statement?
They were doing like a checklist. Is my company listed?
Yeah, step 1, issue the statement. Step 2, make the donation. And honestly, they received a lot of those companies received a lot of positive press, and there's value for that. They received a lot of goodwill. There's a lot of value in that. So a lot of that was somewhat self-serving.
Well, so and it could have been self-serving for sure, but I would take it any day, in the sense of the interest and the willingness to even use the term race and racism in conversations in corporate America, because to your point, that has always been a really uncomfortable place to be. So talk to me a little bit about, what are the 3 ingredients that are needed to really engage in these productive conversations about racial equity and say racial equity and justice, and the role that the business community should play in that.
Right. So I wrote that article about the 3 ingredients that I saw that so many organizations need, because I found that it's exactly what you were talking about. They wanted to open the door. They wanted to have this conversation. They wanted to be bold. They wanted to approach these topics that they had never approached before, but it wasn't working out so well. Like, people were getting uncomfortable, or they started bobbing and weaving, and well, we were going to talk it. Well, we're going to cancel that meeting. The next thing you know, the next 2 meetings got canceled, and now we forgot what we were supposed to be talking about. So in my view, I think that there are 3 fundamental ingredients that really are necessary if we want, and I say we in terms of organizations, if we want to responsibly handle these topics in a new, different, much more serious and intentional way. I think the first one is racial literacy. Okay. And that's a hard one. That is a hard one. After George Floyd's murder, I dug in like a lot of other people and said, what can I do? I knew I wanted to lean into this in a different way. I've had a training company for 20 years. I didn't do DEI work, didn't have a DEI background, but I knew I wanted to lean into anti-racism. I read about, over that next 18 months, I read about 80 books on anti-racism, on history of oppression in this country, because I needed to educate myself. And I thought I was educated. I went to Spelman, and I had, relatives in the movement, marched with John Lewis, helped start SNCC. But I learned so much. And that learning just was transformative. It was transformative because the racial issues we're dealing with today are so much more nuanced. They're so much more subtle. It's not, the KKK in the lynching, even though that still happens. Let me just say that still happens, but it's not the bulk of it. And particularly in workplaces, the bulk of it doesn't necessarily present in such an overt way. So that literacy, that education piece is so critical. It's almost like if, you have a PhD in chemistry and I, flunk chemistry, and we're trying to have a conversation about it. It's like we have to at least have the same understanding of our history. And that's why Nicole Hannah-Jones' work with the 1619 Project is so transformative, because it just speaks to the fact that we need to understand our history. So the racial literacy is number one. And with that, we also need to have humility. We can't both come into the conversation feeling like, well, I just need to force you to view it the way I view it, or to think about it from my perspective. We also have to have just some level of humility and a willingness to hear the other person, to be open to broadening our perspective. And then I submit that when you put those two together, you get what, I didn't coin the term, but someone came up with this term, racial stamina, that I love. And it's that ability to continue to engage in the conversation. It's what makes you not, how a lot of people have that reflexive urge to shut down, or that reflexive defensiveness as soon as I say the word privilege, or as soon as I say racial apartheid, or as soon as I say something, because these conversations are triggering for a lot of people. And I think that in and of itself is insightful. But once you have those two, you develop the stamina that allows you to just continue to engage in a thoughtful, productive way in the conversation, so that things just don't completely shut down.
Well, so those 3 points, racial literacy, humility, and racial stamina, and I'm intrigued by that, because I know you've heard all of the debate on critical race theory, and the fact that these schools are saying we don't want slavery and all of this other stuff to be taught to their children, because it really projects a negative image on whites and their interactions of their forefathers and foremothers during that period. So how can, with this political and cultural push against critical race theory, and against really talking about and exploring our history and what actually evolved, that makes the racial literacy really challenging, does it not?
You hit the nail on the head. The reason why, you can tell, if it wasn't important, they wouldn't be fighting against it. The fact that there's so much fervor against it tells you there's power in that. Because once people know the truth, once people really understand the history, understand the background, understand how we got here, then it's almost like slaves not being allowed to read or write. When they were growing up, they knew there was power in knowing how to read. in knowing how to write, knowing these things. That's why they banned it. That's why they didn't let them do it, because they knew there was power. And so obviously the debate is not really about CRT. The debate is about US history. The debate is about having a full and thorough and accurate accounting of US history, as we would any other subject. You certainly don't not teach kids about diseases because you don't want them to be upset. You don't not teach them about the Holocaust. You don't not teach them about wars, about nuclear war. I mean, there are a lot, that's just part of humanity. I mean, that's just part of being an informed person on the planet.
And Dana, to your point, we did a lot of sessions with many of our clients where we had what we call meaningful conversations about race. And the majority of these clients in these sessions were predominantly white, many in the South. And the whites in our courses would say, why didn't I know this? When we talked about gerrymandering or drawing lines in terms of where banks would fund or would not fund certain real estate or certain purchases. It was amazing, the number of whites who said, why wasn't I taught this? Why didn't I know anything about it? And you could see and experience how transformative this racial literacy element that you talked about, how critical that was, because by them having that information and then having an environment where it was safe to talk about it and safe to say, I don't know. I didn't know that. Why was I denied that? It was just so powerful and so compelling. And the kinds of relationships that were established with people in those sessions between Blacks and Latinas or whites and Blacks and whatever was just phenomenal, because they did have a common place and a common understanding from where they could really start talking about who I am and what matters to me. So the point you're making is just absolutely awesome. So let me ask you this, with all of this kind of negative, these culture wars that they talk about and the fact of how it's impacting our political elections and stuff, how has the response been to you? I mean, have you received hostility or any kind of negative pushback because you're talking about this anti-racist approach in such a candid way?
And actually, I'll just share with you, what happened for me, my personal story. So as I mentioned before, I had a company for 20 years doing training, and I train on traditional professional development topics like project management, leadership skills, managing up, facilitation. But after George Floyd and Amy Cooper, which people forget happened the same day, the woman in Central Park.
Right. This is the one that's what called the police on this Black guy.
Right. Who weaponized her white womanhood in that moment, in a split second, to try to call the police on him, even though she was the person violating the law. Right. Because and that's why I bring her up, because as tragic, as horribly tragic as George Floyd was, most Black people in particular are much more likely. Now, Amy Cooper, she's somebody's boss, or she was somebody's boss. I'm sure she had a team.
She worked on Wall Street.
From what I understand, worked in the finance industry.
Yeah, she worked on Wall Street.
Much more likely to have an Amy Cooper as our neighbor, or as our kids' coach, or a teacher, or a lawyer, or a judge. So both of those together just really, really motivated me. And so I, as I said, it's too much. Because when I saw George Floyd, all I could think about was it was 29 years earlier. Lord, I just blanked on his name. Rodney King. I was like, gosh. And I remember I was at Spelman at the time, and we were watching cars burn.
I know, and I was living in LA, right around the next neighborhood over from the riot. So that was.
And you think about this, 30 years, 29 years, and we're still dealing with this. So it really shook me, as I'm sure it did a lot of other people. And so I just tried to think, because my feeling is there's a lot of work, not all of us can be policymakers and, be attorneys at LDF and do the transformative work that they do, but each of us can make a difference in our little sphere. And in fact, one of my favorite quotes is Margaret Mead, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has. And so really, without thinking, I said, you know what, I was writing in my Forbes Careers column, as I always am, and I just wrote an article. I said, these are 10 things, I think it was Dear White People, 10 things you can do to advance anti-racism. And then I wrote another one, Dear White People, here are 5 uncomfortable truths your Black colleagues need you to know. And in a way, I felt like I was a little bit of a vessel, because I knew there were a lot of Black and brown people working in companies who wanted to say things, but felt they couldn't say it.
Right. Yeah.
And so I said, well, I'm going to say it. I certainly remember my corporate time. And so I said it, but even though I didn't have a traditional corporate job, I still, I still could have been fired by my clients. I didn't check with, my clients, and I don't have an HR to go to. I don't really have any recourse. My clients fire me, and that's it. So I just put it out there, and surprisingly, in a way, the feedback was overwhelmingly positive. Now, I've had some trolls. I mean, I've had, death threats, but it's honestly really, really rare. The overwhelming feedback that I got, and I will say, particularly at the time, because I think at the time, everyone was leaning into this. And so there was more space. There was more than there has been in the past. There was more opportunity to be more bold. And I'm so glad that we continue to push on that, because I think a lot of that, the change hasn't been as significant and as durable and as lasting as I would have wanted it to be. But I definitely think there has been change. I can even see it on LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn all the time. And the conversations changed, the boldness changed, the definition of professionalism, I think, has really changed. And that's not just about racism, it's about other things as well. But to answer your question, overwhelmingly, the feedback was positive.
Great. And what do you, and it was positive because of what? What were the factors that drove that being positive?
Well, I think that companies were reaching out to me because they felt like, Houston, we have a problem, and we need somebody to help us unpack this. Clearly, we're not equipped to do it. So I think that was positive. I think a lot of Black people, that book that came out so long ago, gosh, why am I blacking on her name? Another, why do all the Black kids sit together in the cafeteria? And I think kind of the analogy, when I read that book and loved it, the analogy is, well, why are all the Black people, huddling together at work? It's kind of that same sort of phenomenon. And so I think, to your question, why did I get the positive reaction? I think also a lot of Black and brown people are tired, and we're tired and have been tired, and wanted more attention on this problem, on this issue. And there were a lot of things that they've wanted to speak up about for so long. In fact, I got into not a social media food fight, but a little back and forth years ago when this first started. And this one Black woman, she thanked me, but then she said, I never would say anything until I was doing my exit interview, and then I let them have it. Yeah. And I was really kind of encouraging her, pushing her to speak up. I'm like, when you're doing your exit interview, it's certainly not helping you at that point. It's kind of too late. Maybe it'll help the next person. I don't know. But I just wish we would find that agency, find that courage to advocate for ourselves and demand more. So overwhelmingly, the feedback was positive.
I'm so glad you shared that, because a lot of times people don't step up and speak their truth and share their lived experience because they're afraid of the feedback that will be negative. And so, yours is such a wonderful example about how speaking up and telling your truth can generate a lot more positive interaction than they anticipated. Well, I must tell you, Dana Brownlee, that we are probably at the end, we are at the end of our show, but I would like for you to share for companies in particular, because you just gave us the example with the woman who said I should have spoken up, or I didn't speak up, I spoke up at my exit interview. But what's one thing that a corporation or government agency or a not-for-profit can do to really continue the dialogue around race, around racism in their space?
Yeah, so lots of things. I think that one of the most important things that I really like to recommend is look at the data, look at the numbers. Too often, I think we get caught up in the emotion and then we just don't get very far. So I like to say, look at the data, look at those numbers, and what are those numbers telling you? And if you see disparities, then do the root cause analysis. Start with the problem and then ask why 5 times. That's one of the techniques that I learned in industrial engineering, to try to get to the root cause and fix that. It doesn't always have to be, I mean, I think these conversations around race are important. Of course, the racial literacy is important. Of course, bringing in speakers who are really going to speak truth to power and really are going to go beyond where we've gone before is really important. All of that's important. But I think that in terms of lasting, durable, significant change, we oftentimes need to change policies. We need to change processes. That's the systemic nature of it. And so we need to treat it as a problem the same way we would treat other business problems. Do the root cause analysis, figure out what's causing the disparity, and then change that.
Well, Dana, I just thank you so much for carving out time in your busy day to really share with us this whole notion of an understand, creating a better understanding of anti-racism work. It's been very illustrative and very rich, and I thank you for your candor. And so just like to say on behalf of our Working It Out crew and our viewers and our listeners, I just really thank you again. And I wish all of our viewers and listeners a safe, productive, and what we call Be Happy Week. I'm Dr. Vanessa Weaver, signing off. Bye-bye.
Working It Out is brought to you by Alignment Strategies, a management consultancy with more than 3 decades of experience in diversity, equity and inclusion, and organizational development. To learn more, visit alignmentstrategies.com.
Got problems on the job, we're working it out. Workplace got you stressing, we're working it out. Yeah, we're working it out, working it out, working it out.